Sometimes a simple knock on a door can open up a chapter you never saw coming. I've delivered groceries for years, houses, apartments, trailers, even cabins in the woods, but I never expected a single delivery to pull me into someone's quiet grief, their guarded hope, and ultimately into a kind of connection I didn't know I needed. It wasn't love in the traditional sense, not at first, and maybe not ever in the way people usually expect. But it was something deeper, something that lived in the spaces between sorrow and laughter. And it all started with a paper bag tearing. At the edge of her porch steps, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the air still carried a chill even though the sun was rising strong. My shift had started like any other early, with too much caffeine and not enough sleep. I had 9 deliveries stacked into my route, and the address that would change everything was 7th on the list. I remember that because the 5th customer had argued over a missing bottle of almond milk that wasn't even in their order. The 6th had a dog that barked loud enough to rattle my rearview mirror. By the time I pulled into the cracked driveway of 1037 Rosewood Lane, I was hoping this drop-off would be quiet, quick, and uneventful. The house looked like it had been loved once, and then left to age gently in its own way. Not neglected, just slow. The white paint on the wooden trim had softened into something closer to ivory, and the flower beds were more weeds than blossoms. There was a wind chime on the porch that made a low, haunting sound as the breeze passed through it. It didn't feel creepy. It felt old, tired, maybe, but peaceful. I grabbed the first 2 bags from the trunk and made my way up the walk. As I reached the porch, the screen door creaked open before I could even knock. There she was, shoulders straight, eyes alert, but with a heaviness you could see even before you noticed the black sweater she clutched at the sleeves. Her silver-streaked hair was tied in a loose braid that hung over one shoulder, and her face had that kind of beauty you earn, not the kind you inherit. She didn't smile right away, but she nodded, and that felt like permission. "You can set them down right there," she said. And I followed the gesture to a small bench beside the door. I nodded back and returned to the car for the rest of the bags. I was careful, but one of the paper handles gave out just as I stepped back onto the porch.
Oh!
A few apples rolled across the weathered wood, and before I could bend to catch them, she was already moving. She didn't rush, but there was a quiet urgency to how she knelt, gathered the fruit, and looked up at me like I'd dropped something more valuable than groceries. That's when I really looked at her eyes. They were blue, but not bright. More. Like a lake in early winter still, reflective and deep. "Sorry about that," I said, chuckling awkwardly. "Guess I should have double-bagged." She gave a small smile, barely there. "It happens, no harm done." I started placing the remaining bags on the bench when she added, "Would you mind putting the heavier ones just inside the door?" Knees aren't what they used to be. It wasn't an unusual request. Plenty of customers asked for help carrying things inside, but something about the way she asked, gentle, careful not to assume, made me pause. I agreed, of course, and stepped through the doorway into a home that smelled faintly of cinnamon and something floral, maybe lavender. It was tidy, but filled with signs of a life lived slowly. Framed photos lined the hallway wall, all in soft lighting, many of them black and white. A grandfather clock ticked steadily from the corner of the living room. There was a blanket folded neatly over the back of a floral armchair, and next to it, a small wooden table with a book lying open face down. Someone had been reading. Someone had stopped. And from the absence of sound, no TV, no music, no hum of conversation, I figured that someone was likely just her. Once I'd set the last bag down, turned to say goodbye, but she was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're new," she said after a moment. "I've had deliveries from this service before. You're not the usual guy." I nodded. "Yeah, they reshuffled the routes this week. I'm Mateo." "Mateo," she repeated, as though tasting the sound. "I'm Eleanor. Thank you for being careful with the eggs." That made me laugh, and to my surprise, she laughed too. Not a full belly laugh, more like a rusted hinge being coaxed back to life. I stepped back toward the door. Well, enjoy the rest of your morning, Eleanor. And just as I reached for the screen door, she said it. Soft, almost too softly to catch, but clear. I haven't felt this way since my husband died. I froze, my hand hovering in midair. Not because I was uncomfortable, but because I wasn't sure I'd heard her right. I turned slowly, unsure whether to respond, ask, or let it sit. She seemed to realize what she'd said. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest, fingers pressing lightly as though to push the words back in. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I shouldn't have said that. That's not your burden. But something about the moment told me it wasn't a burden. It was. Key. One she hadn't handed to anyone in a long time. It's okay, I said quietly. Really? We stood there in silence for a few seconds more before she nodded, and I left. I got back into my car with my heart knocking just a little harder than usual. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. But something had cracked open. In her. In me. In the space between a delivery driver and a widow who hadn't expected anything more than produce and paper bags that morning, and though I didn't know it yet, that was the start of something neither of us had planned for. I didn't tell anyone. About Eleanor that day, not even my roommate, who usually got an earful about every weird customer, barking dog, or tipless delivery. Something about that morning felt like it didn't belong in the usual category of daily complaints or small talk. It lingered with me through the rest of the route, not in a heavy way. But like a melody, I couldn't place a faint tune echoing in the back of my head. By the time I pulled into the delivery hub and clocked out, her words had replayed in my mind a dozen times. I haven't felt this way since my husband died. It was the kind of thing people didn't just blurt out, especially not to someone they'd known for 5 minutes. But it hadn't sounded desperate. It hadn't even sounded sad. Anything, it sounded surprised like something inside her had stirred awake without her permission. Maybe something in me had done the same. The next day, I didn't see her name on my route, and I tried not to be disappointed, telling myself it was better that way. One visit, a moment, a kindness shared between strangers. That should have been enough. But when Thursday rolled around, and her address was 7th on my list again same as before, I felt that strange pulse in my chest. A low hum of anticipation mixed with something quieter, almost reverent. I arrived around the same time as I had before, mid-morning, and the house looked the same, still silent. The wind chimes swayed gently in the breeze like it had been waiting. This time when I stepped onto the porch, the door was already ajar, as if she'd been listening for me. She opened it fully as I approached. I caught a glimpse of her again in a deep blue cardigan, with a small clip in her hair that I hadn't noticed before, one shaped like a rose. There was color in her cheeks this time, subtle but present, like she'd slept better, or maybe just stood in the sunlight longer that morning. I gave a polite nod, but before I could say anything, she held the door open and said, "Come in, Mateo, if you don't mind." There wasn't a question in her voice, but there also wasn't pressure. It felt like an invitation shaped out of courtesy, but offered with meaning. I carried the bags inside, already noting small changes in the house. A vase of fresh tulips on the entry table. A new photo frame on the wall. The same cinnamon lavender scent, but stronger now, like she'd lit a candle an hour before I arrived. I wondered if she had. Once everything was on the kitchen counter, I turned to leave, but she surprised me again. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, her voice light but steady. I blinked, caught off guard. I'd had customers offer me water before, maybe a granola bar, if they were especially friendly, but never tea. Never with that kind of composure. Like this wasn't just a transaction anymore. I told myself it wouldn't take long, had extra time between stops anyway. So I nodded, and she smiled in a way that reached the edges of her eyes. We sat in her sunlit kitchen, the kind with old cabinets and chip tile that somehow felt more lived in than worn-down. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She poured the tea into delicate porcelain cups with little birds painted along the rim. I asked her about the design, and she said her husband had bought the set for their anniversary 30 years ago. That was the first time she mentioned him directly. And I noticed how gently she cradled the cup afterward, as though the memory lived in the weight of it. We didn't talk about anything. Heavy at first. She asked how long I'd been delivering, if I liked it where I grew up. I told her about my mom, about how we used to live in a tiny apartment above a bakery, and how I still couldn't stand the smell of burnt bread because of it. She laughed. At that, a real laugh this time. The kind that pulled her shoulders back and made her eyes crinkle at the corners. It didn't feel like a customer laughing. It felt like a person remembering what laughter was supposed to feel like. I stayed for 30 minutes, maybe 40. When I left, she said thank you not just for the groceries, but for the conversation. That's how she phrased it. Thank you for the conversation. As though it were a gift I'd handed her. Back in my car, I sat with my hands on the wheel for a full minute before starting the engine. I knew I shouldn't be drawn to her. Not like that. She was older, clearly still mourning something I could only guess at, and I was just the delivery guy who happened to be polite and new. But the way she looked at me wasn't with desperation. It wasn't with longing either. It was with something simpler. Presence. As if I was the first person in a long time who had looked her in the eye, and stayed long enough to be seen in return. The next time I delivered to her, she'd made cookies. Oatmeal raisin. I hated oatmeal raisin. But I ate 3 because she'd placed them on a little plate with a paper doily and smiled like it mattered. And it did. It really did. We didn't talk about her husband that day. Instead, we talked about her garden, which she hadn't tended in 2 years, and the neighbor's cat. Would like to sunbathe on her porch but refused to be touched. She told me she used to paint, mostly landscapes, but hadn't picked up a brush since the funeral. She didn't say whose funeral, but I didn't ask. I already knew. What surprised me most was how easy it was to talk to her. I wasn't trying to impress her. I wasn't trying to be charming or clever. I was just me tired, sometimes awkward, sometimes unsure, and she didn't seem to mind. If anything, she seemed to like that I wasn't performing. It made me wonder how many people had treated her like glass since she lost him. How many had offered pity instead of presence. Each visit started to blur into the next after that. Not because they weren't meaningful, but because they stopped feeling like separate events and started feeling like part of a slow rhythm, a quiet pull. I began looking forward to her address the way you look forward to a warm light at the end of a long hall. Not blinding. It's not dramatic. Just ... steady. I didn't know what this was yet. Friendship, maybe. Companionship. Something unnamed, but undeniable. All I knew was that I was beginning to measure my weeks by the time I spent at her kitchen table, sipping tea from porcelain birds and forgetting for a while how heavy the world outside could be. There's a strange kind of peace that comes from being let into someone else's quiet. Not just their space, but their silence, the parts of their life they don't dress up for company. The still corners they don't usually let anyone near. That's what being around Eleanor started to feel like. Not a loud, sweeping welcome, but a soft unfolding, slow, deliberate loosening of something she'd been holding on to for too long. I didn't try to pry. I never asked about her husband, or how long it had been since he passed. I didn't bring up the photograph I'd seen once on her mantel of her standing beside a tall man with dark eyes and a smile like mischief. I didn't ask why the frame was dusted so carefully, or why the clock beside it had been stopped at 3:14. Some silences aren't meant to be filled. Some are meant to be shared. What I did notice were the small changes. The way her voice grew a little stronger each week, more playful in tone. The way she started answering the door before I even knocked. One morning, she wore a shade of lipstick I hadn't seen before, a soft mauve that made her look just a little younger, not in age, but in spirit. Another time, I caught her humming under her breath as she prepared our TRT, as it had quietly become. There were days I stayed, for an hour, sometimes less, sometimes more. My delivery schedule didn't allow it, not technically. But I'd begun waking up earlier, moving faster, rearranging my routes so that Eleanor's house always came at the end. I told myself it was for convenience. Deep down, I knew it was because I didn't want to be rushed when I was with her. I didn't want to feel the ticking of the clock while we sat and watched the steam curl from our cups like breath on a cold morning. She asked about my life now, not just my past. What I wanted, what I was hoping for. I told her about my half-finished associate's degree in art. How I'd dropped out when my dad got sick and never found the right time to go back. I told her I used to sketch people on the subway and once dreamed of illustrating children's books. She didn't laugh. She didn't even tilt her head in that polite way people do when they're trying to sound supportive. She just listened. Then she asked, very plainly, why I'd stopped. I told her life got in the way. The bills needed paying, and dreams didn't keep the lights on. She nodded, and I thought that would be the end of it. But the next week she gave me a gift. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with a thin green ribbon, like something out of a vintage shop window. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook, the good kind, with thick ivory pages and a faint smell of something like cedar. There was no note, just my name, written neatly on the inside cover, in handwriting that reminded me of old library cards. I looked up at her. She only said, "In case you find the time again." I didn't know what to say. The gesture was too gentle, too intentional, not extravagant, but meaningful in a way that lodged itself under my ribs and stayed there for the rest of the day. I didn't open the sketchbook right away. I carried it in my car, then left it on my nightstand, and finally took it out and drew a picture of Eleanor's kitchen, her teacups, the little blue lamp in the corner, the folds of her cardigan, sleeve resting on the table's edge. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even very good, but it was real, and that felt like enough. As spring crept in, her house began to change too. The weeds in her garden were cleared. A few pansies appeared near the walkway, their purple faces bobbing gently in the breeze. The porch chairs were cleaned off, and the wind chime was polished until it caught the light like a prism. One day I caught her outside watering the flower bed, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face. She looked younger in that moment than I'd ever seen her, still weathered, still rooted in her years, but alive in a way I hadn't known to expect. She waved when she saw me, and I waved back. And something in that simple exchange felt like a page turning. But not every moment was light. There were days when she didn't smile, when her voice was distant, her eyes clouded with something far away. On those days, I didn't ask questions. I just brought in the groceries, made the tea, and sat with her in the silence. She once told me that grief wasn't like a wound you stitched up and forgot. It was more like the weather, a system you learned to live in. Sometimes sunny, sometimes storming, always moving through you. I told her I didn't know much about loss. She said softly, "You will someday." And it wasn't a curse. It wasn't even sad. It was just true. There was a Saturday, an unusual delivery day for me, when she called the service and specifically requested me, said she needed something extra, and asked if they could send the young man with the kind eyes. I didn't. No, she'd made the request until my supervisor handed me the note with a shrug. "Guess you made an impression," he said, not unkindly. That delivery was different. She'd ordered barely anything, just a few items: a bottle of wine, a bag of fresh strawberries, and a small wheel of brie. I found that odd until I arrived and saw that she'd set a table on the back patio. Table for two. She didn't call it a date. Neither did I, but we both knew it was a kind of invitation, a way of asking, "Can you stay a little longer?" We ate in the late afternoon sun, the light catching the edges of her glass and throwing little glints onto the table. She told me about her first kiss, about the time she got lost in Paris and ended up finding her favorite cafe by accident. I told her about my fear of flying, how I used to have nightmares about falling out of the sky. She said, "Everyone's afraid of something." Then she looked at me, very still, and said, "I was afraid I'd never feel anything again." Then you showed up with a torn paper bag and apples rolling down my porch. I didn't know how to respond to that, not really. But I reached across the table, just enough for our fingers to touch, and she let them stay there. Not clasped, not gripped, just resting, steady, warm. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just a connection born of kindness or shared time. It was something else, something neither of us had named yet, but both of us had started to build, quietly, carefully, together. By the time April was in full bloom, it felt like the days at Eleanor's had taken on their own quiet rhythm, like chapters in a book no one else was reading but us. I didn't talk about her to many people, not because I was hiding anything, but because I didn't have the words to explain it. How do you describe a relationship that doesn't quite fit any box? It wasn't dating, not in the traditional sense, and yet it went beyond friendship. Deeper than familiarity, warmer than coincidence. It was the way she knew when I'd had a long day before I said a word. The way I'd started to notice the tiniest shifts in her expression, like when the lightness in her voice was real or when it was borrowed. The connection wasn't loud, but it was rooted. Like an old tree that didn't need to prove it was strong. She started letting me help with more things around the house. Fixing a squeaky hinge on her cabinet, placing a light bulb she couldn't reach, helping move an old armchair from the guest room to the back porch. Little things, each one small enough on its own, but when you looked at them together, they formed a pattern, teeny acts of trust, tiny invitations to stay a little longer. I never minded the extra effort. If anything, it felt like an honor. There was a kind of care in those tasks that went beyond utility, a shared presence. It's a reason to keep showing up. One day I brought my sketchbook with me. It's the one she'd gifted me weeks ago. I didn't plan to, not consciously, but it had been sitting in my passenger seat when I left for work, and something in me told me not to leave it behind. That afternoon, after we finished our tea, she asked if I was still drawing. I hesitated, then pulled the sketchbook out from my bag and set it gently on the table. She opened it with the same care one might give to turning the pages of a journal, her fingers slow and deliberate. She stopped at the page where I'd drawn her kitchen, our kitchen. As I was beginning to think of and smiled. "You captured it," she said. Her voice hushed. "It's not perfect, but it's true. That matters more." I wanted to tell her how long it had been since anyone had said something like that to me. How, in the quiet of her home, I'd started remembering who I was before everything got tangled with responsibilities and disappointments. But I didn't. I just watched her flip through the pages, pausing now and then, nodding quietly to herself, like she was reading between the lines of what I had drawn. After that, she asked if I'd sketched the garden. It had started coming back to life under her care. Violets, marigolds, the beginnings of basil and rosemary sprouting in pots by the windowsill. I spent nearly an hour out there that day, my pencil working as she hummed softly from her seat near the roses. The sky was the kind of pale blue you only get after a week of rain, and the breeze was gentle, like it knew not to disturb what was happening. When I handed her the finished piece, she didn't say anything at first. Just touched the corner of the page, her eyes a little glassy, and whispered, "It's nice to be seen." The thing about Eleanor was that she never demanded attention, but once you gave it, you realized how much there was to notice. The way she kept her sugar in a mason jar, even though the lid didn't seal properly. The way she kept a notepad by the sink, where she jotted down quotes from whatever book she was reading. The way she always left the porch light on until she saw my car pulling into the drive, even on bright afternoons. It was as if she'd spent so long dimming her own presence that the world had learned to walk past her. But I didn't want to walk past her. I wanted to sit beside her and hear everything she hadn't said in years. That month, something began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but like the slow stretch of daylight across the floor as spring turned toward summer. She started cooking again, not just reheating or assembling, but truly cooking soups from scratch, bread that filled the house with warmth, stews that simmered for hours. I started arriving earlier, sometimes even on my days off. Told myself it was just to help her with groceries or to check the leaky faucet in her bathroom, but we both knew better. The line between duty and desire had quietly disappeared, and neither of us was pretending anymore. Then came the scrapbook. I noticed it one afternoon, sitting on the coffee table, its cover worn and fraying at the edges. She didn't move to hide it, didn't pretend it wasn't there. Instead, she placed her hand on it gently and said, "Would you like to see?" I sat beside her as she turned the pages. Old photographs in black and white, her wedding day. Husband in a military uniform, trip to Greece. Birthdays, anniversaries, random Tuesday afternoons, captured by film and preserved like precious stones. She told me his name, Thomas. Said it with both strength and softness, like someone whose memory no longer hurt to speak aloud, but still deserved reverence. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her voice carried everything: the joy, the ache, the gratitude, and the emptiness. That still lived in the corners of her house. I listened. That was all I did. I didn't try to comfort her. I didn't compare her loss to anything in my life. I just let her talk. When she closed the book and looked at me, I saw something different in her eyes. Not sorrow, not longing, but a kind of surrender. Like she was finally allowing herself to be where she was, not stuck in the past, not afraid of what might come next. Just here with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the photos in my mind, the way she'd traced the lines of his face with her fingertips, and then the way she'd looked at me afterward. Not to replace him, not to forget him, but to let herself feel something again. I realized then that this wasn't about falling in love, not yet. It was about stepping into someone's grief without fear. It's about letting them step into your life without needing a reason. And I was already in it, whether I'd meant to be or not. What we were building wasn't quick or dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing you wrote poems about or posted online, but it was real, solid, grounded in truth and time and the quiet willingness to show up for each other again and again. And somehow, without ever saying the words, we both understood what it was. The morning air was starting to shift into that early summer kind of warmth, the kind that clings to your shirt just enough to make you roll the windows down, but still cool enough to make you breathe a little deeper. I remember that because it was a Sunday, and Sundays had become something new for me, something gentler. I had adjusted my schedule, taken fewer jobs, and carved out space in my life that I didn't even realize had been packed too tight. And that space, slowly but inevitably, had been filled by Eleanor. What had started as a favor, a delivery, an accidental moment with apples rolling across an old porch had unraveled into something I couldn't name but felt down to the bone. I didn't question it anymore. I just lived it. That particular Sunday, I brought a thermos of coffee and 2 pastries from the corner bakery near my apartment. The one with the flaky croissants that Eleanor always mentioned but never bought herself. She had a habit of denying herself little indulgences, as if joy had to be earned through a certain number of solitary years. I was determined to break that cycle, even if it was one sweet bite at a time. When I pulled into her driveway, she was already outside, tending to the marigolds again, wearing that same wide-brimmed hat that made her look like she belonged in a painting. Her gloves were caked in soil, her cheeks touched by the sun, and when she looked up and saw me standing there with a bag in one hand and coffee in the other, she smiled like someone who had just remembered a pleasant dream. We sat on the porch. Steps, and I passed her the croissant, already flaking at the edges. She took a bite, paused, and made a quiet, surprised sound, as if she'd forgotten what it meant to enjoy something so simple, so unabashedly. We didn't talk much at first. The birds were louder than our words, the wind carrying the scent of lavender and freshly watered soil. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes you didn't need a conversation, you just needed company. After a while, she asked if I'd stay and help her move a few pots around the side yard. It wasn't a big job, but it took longer than expected because we kept pausing her to catch her breath. Me to admire the way she had arranged everything with such care, like each pot had a story or a mood it was supposed to reflect. When we finished, we sat in the shade on 2 old lawn chairs.
Damn.
And that's when she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about where you'll be in 10 years?" She asked, her voice even but low, like she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. I didn't respond right away. 10 years had always felt too far to plan for, too hazy to sketch out. I'd spent so much of my life moving day to day, paycheck to paycheck, obligation to obligation. But sitting next to her, I tried to imagine who I might become, what parts of me might still be here, what might change, what I'd be brave enough to reach for. "I guess I hope I'm still creating something," I finally said. "Still helping people, still connected to something that matters." She nodded slowly, staring ahead. "That's a good hope," she said. "Better than most." And then, very softly, she added, "I didn't plan for the second half of my life. I thought the story was over when he died. Didn't think there would be another chapter. I turned toward her, not speaking, not interrupting. But here we are, she continued, her hands folded in her lap. And there's a strange comfort in knowing that maybe not everything is finished. That was the closest she'd come to. Naming what was between us, not directly, not with labels or declarations, but in that quiet acknowledgement that the heart, even when wounded, still holds space. That maybe life didn't stop building new bridges just because one had collapsed behind you. From that day on, we developed what I can only describe as a kind of ritual. Sunday mornings became ours, not officially, not with plans made in advance, but with an unspoken understanding. I'd arrive with coffee and something sweet, and she'd be there with a task or a thought or just the need for someone to sit beside her as the morning softened into afternoon. We read books together, sometimes, out loud, sometimes side by side. We listened to old records, ones she hadn't played in years. She had this crackling vinyl of Ella Fitzgerald that she claimed was scratched beyond salvation. But when I played it anyway, the imperfections only made the music feel more alive. Like a ghost dancing in the room with us. She told me stories about her childhood, how she once snuck out to climb the water tower in her tiny Texas town, how she learned to swim in a river so murky her mother nearly fainted when she came home covered in silt, how she met Thomas at a bookstore, both reaching for the same copy of A Farewell to Arms. She laughed as she told me how he had tried to impress her by quoting Hemingway, but mispronounced valise. I laughed too, not just at the image of it, but at the way her eyes lit up when she remembered him, not with grief, but with warmth. We never talked about what we were to each other. There were no awkward conversations, no lines drawn or erased. But everything we did was layered with a kind of intention that made it obvious. We mattered. I mattered to her, and she mattered to me. Not just in the now, but in the way someone becomes a part of your interior landscape, shaping how you move through the world, even when you're apart. But life has a way of testing quiet joys. One afternoon I arrived to find her front door closed and no sign of her on the porch. I knocked gently. No answer. I waited. Finally, I let myself walk around to the garden, unsure if I was being intrusive or worried. For nothing. That's when I saw her, sitting in the grass, knees pulled up, her hat beside her. Her arms wrapped around herself in a way that made her look small, breakable. I didn't speak. I just approached slowly, knelt beside her, and waited. She didn't look at me right away. When she finally did, her eyes were red, her mouth drawn in that tight, brave way people do when they're trying not to fall apart completely. "It would have been his birthday," she whispered. "Today." And all I could do was place my hand gently on her back and let her cry. No words, no attempts to fix anything, just presence, just warmth. That day, we didn't have tea, didn't move pots or talk about the past or the future. We just sat there, two people in the grass, holding space for something neither of us could fully explain. And for the first time, I understood something Eleanor had been teaching me all along: some of the greatest gifts you can give another person are silence, understanding, and the courage to return again the next day. There was something different about Eleanor after that afternoon in the garden. Something that didn't show up in her face or voice so much as in her pause, in the way she seemed to breathe between moments, as though each breath was its own careful act of remembrance. Grief, she had once told me, wasn't something you healed from, it was something you carried better over time. But even knowing that, I saw how heavy that day had been for her. Like a stone she'd been holding in her chest that finally pressed too hard against the walls of her heart. The next time I visited, her eyes were less tired, though still rimmed with that familiar shade of something unspoken. She had baked muffins blueberry. Her favorite Anne left the porch light on even though the sun was still bright in the sky. I stepped onto the porch, and she greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but was honest in its own way, as if to say, "I'm still here." We sat inside that day, the kitchen a little warmer than usual, the windows cracked, just enough to let the breeze move through. She told me stories not about Thomas this time, but about herself, stories she hadn't shared before. How she once wrote poems in secret notebooks and burned them the day before her wedding because she didn't think anyone would take them seriously. How she'd always wanted to see the northern lights, but never found the right moment. How she used to dream of buying a camper van and just driving with no destination, only stopping where the view felt right. These weren't just old memories. They were unlived versions of her life, the parallel paths that had existed only in imagination. And as she spoke, I began to realize something that settled deep in my chest. Eleanor wasn't just grieving a person. She was grieving the parts of herself that had gone silent when he died. I don't know when I started thinking of her house as familiar, not just in the way you recognize a place, but in the way a place begins to feel like a reflection of your own rhythms. I knew which floorboards creaked the loudest and which cabinet stuck unless you nudged it just right. I knew how she liked her tea steeped and which spoon she used to stir in her honey. I knew the sound of her laugh when it was genuine, the kind that made her eyes shimmer and her voice drop slightly in pitch. Being around her wasn't exciting the way people often describe romance. It was steady, reliable, safe, and somehow that made it more precious. We never spoke in terms of ownership. There were no declarations, no mine or yours, but there were signs. Like the way she started setting out 2 cups every morning, even before she knew whether I'd show up, or the way I started keeping a jacket on her coat rack, just in case the weather turned. These weren't decisions. They were quiet, mutual acknowledgments that we existed together in a space that was no longer temporary. I didn't need to live there to feel at home. I already did. Then, one Wednesday, Eleanor surprised me. I had just finished unloading her groceries when she asked if I wanted to go for a drive. It wasn't like her to be spontaneous. Normally, she preferred the comfort of her routines, the quiet comfort of a garden bed or a crossword puzzle. But there was a brightness in her tone that made it hard to refuse. So I said yes, without hesitation. She didn't tell me where we were going, just handed me a set of keys and told me she wanted to see something that wasn't the inside of her house for a while. I drove her old sedan, careful with the brakes, and gentle on the turns, and we headed north out of town. The roads got quieter, the trees taller, the sun lower in the sky. After about 40 minutes, she told me to take a left at an old wooden sign that read Carver's Point. I followed the gravel road until it opened up into a small overlook, a place I hadn't seen before despite living in the area my whole life. From the edge, the land dropped into a soft valley, a patchwork of green and gold stretching out beneath us. The air smelled like pine and old earth. It was the kind of place you'd bring someone to show them something sacred. Eleanor didn't speak at first. She just stood at the edge, her hands resting on the wooden rail, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was searching for something she'd once left behind. I stood beside her, waiting. Finally, she said, "Thomas and I came here once a long time ago. He brought me here when I was pregnant with our first. We just sat, listening to the birds. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should come back and remember that day." She paused then, and I could see the wind catch the strands of her hair, lifting them gently from her shoulders. "I never came back," she said. "Not once. Until now." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat was too tight, and anything I might have said would have felt too small, too clumsy for what the moment required. So I just placed my hand over hers where it rested on the railing, and we stood there together, the silence vast but comforting. That evening, on the drive back, she was quiet, not withdrawn, just contemplative. She looked out the window with a softness that I hadn't seen in her before, like something had settled into place. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She just existed in that space, and I let her, knowing she needed the room to process what that return had stirred. When we arrived back at her house, porch light flicked on as the motion sensor caught us approaching. She looked at me then, her hand still on the car door, and said, "I don't know what this is we're doing, Mateo, but I'm glad we're doing it." I nodded, understanding more than words could explain. That night, I didn't go home right away. I stayed a little longer than usual, helping her put away the last of the groceries and lingering in the doorway until the moment felt too quiet to break. When I finally stepped outside, the wind chime on the porch gave a low, almost wistful sound, like it too, had been listening to everything we'd said. I drove home in the dark, the road lit only by scattered street lamps, and the fading memory of the sunset we had watched together. Something had changed. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was internal, quiet, but it was real. We were becoming something we hadn't planned, shaped not by romance in the traditional sense, but by time, by trust, and by the simple fact that we kept showing up. Summer had a way of slowing everything down. The days stretched longer, and the heat hummed low in the background like a constant, lazy whisper. It changed the tempo of our lives, not just mine and Eleanor's, but everything around us. The mail came later. The kids on her street played outside longer, their laughter echoing faintly past the hedges. Even the flowers in Eleanor's garden seemed to reach just a little higher toward the sun, as though time itself had taken a deep breath and decided to hold it. By now, it had become routine for me to swing by after my shift, even if she hadn't ordered anything. Sometimes I came with groceries, sometimes with nothing more than a cup of coffee and the promise of presents. There was never any question of whether I was welcome. I simply was. The comfort between us had settled into something rich and textured, like a woven quilt, full of stories that didn't need to be retold aloud. I could sense her mood in the way she answered the door, whether her smile would be bright or soft, whether we'd talk about the garden or spend our time sitting in companionable silence. She had started to open windows again, even on days when the breeze was minimal, and I took that as a sign of progress. Grief has a way of closing things, of sealing off the light. But Eleanor, little by little, had begun letting the light back in, and I, without meaning to, had become part of that process. One day, I found her sitting in the living room with a box of old letters on her lap. She looked up at me as I stepped inside and smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that invited conversation. It was the kind that told me I was about to be let in a little deeper. I sat beside her, close but not crowding, and waited. She reached into the box and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with the kind of carefulness that told you it had mattered once. She opened it and unfolded a letter inside, her fingers trembling just slightly. She didn't read it aloud. Instead, she handed it to me. I hesitated for a moment before taking it. The handwriting was neat, slanted with intention, the ink faded but still legible. It was a letter from Thomas Wrighton during a trip he had taken before their 3rd anniversary. In it, he wrote about missing her voice, about the silence of hotel rooms, about the way he'd looked at a sunset and wished she were there to see it. He mentioned small things, how he'd bought her favorite tea from a local market, how he'd seen a woman in a bookstore who reminded him of her, how he hoped she hadn't let the cat sleep on his pillow while he was gone. The letter was simple and ordinary. And yet there was something profound in that ordinariness. The way love had been wrapped in the mundane, in the everyday details that only two people truly in sync would bother to notice. When I finished reading, I looked up at her. She didn't need me to say anything. Her eyes had filled, not with grief, but with something gentler. Nostalgia, maybe. You're a quiet kind of gratitude. She took the letter back and placed it on top of the others, her hand resting on the box as if to seal it with her touch. I hadn't opened that one in years, she said softly. But today felt like a good day. There was so much she didn't have to say anymore. We had moved past needing explanations. The rhythm of our time together had become a language of its own. I stayed late that day. We watched the sunset from her back porch, a gentle palette of peaches and golds melting into the horizon. She made iced tea and I lit a citronella candle to keep the mosquitoes at bay. The conversation meandered like the light, sometimes deep, sometimes playful. She told me about the time she and Thomas had driven to the coast on a whim, without booking a hotel or planning where they'd eat. She laughed, saying they ended up sleeping in their car and eating gas station sandwiches, but that it was still one of the best weekends of her life. I found myself watching her more closely as she spoke. Not just hearing her words, but noticing the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way her smile curved slightly to one side, the way her fingers danced absent-mindedly over the rim of her glass. I wasn't falling for her in the way most people fall. It wasn't a crash or a burst of heat. It was slower, deeper, like roots growing quietly beneath the surface, steady and unseen. That night, as I was getting ready to leave, She stood at the door with her hand resting on the frame. "You know," she said, "I never expected to feel anything close to this again. After Thomas passed, I figured that part of me had closed up for good." I nodded, sensing the weight behind her words. "But you've reminded me what it's like to be noticed. To be seen not as a memory of who I was, but as the person I am now." She paused, then looked at me directly. "I didn't know I needed that." There was a silence between us after that, not uncomfortable, just full. I wanted to tell her I felt the same. That she had become an anchor for me, a mirror that didn't judge but simply reflected back what I was too busy to see in myself. But I couldn't find the words. So instead, I reached forward and took her hand, warm and familiar, and held it for a moment longer than usual. In the days that followed, I found myself sketching her more often, not directly, never without her knowing, but parts of her. Her kitchen, her garden, the mug she always used, the view from her porch. This was like capturing echoes, pieces of a life that felt more and more like my own. One day I left a drawing tucked beneath the edge of her favorite book on the coffee table. It was of her garden in full bloom, every petal and leaf drawn with a kind of reverence I didn't know I was capable of until I tried. I didn't tell her I'd done it. I just waited. The next time I arrived, the drawing was framed and hung near the kitchen window. She didn't say a word about it. She didn't need to. Her smile as she passed it soft. Knowing said more than anything else could. Something had begun to settle between us, unspoken but undeniable. Not romance in the typical sense, not something built on impulse or desire, but something rooted in presence, in trust, in the knowledge that we had quietly become part of each other's lives in a way that neither of us had expected but both of us had come to cherish. It was a bond not of fire, but of embers constant, glowing, steady, and it warmed more than either of us realized. It was strange. How icily Eleanor's home became the place where my thoughts wandered even when I wasn't there. I would catch myself between deliveries or during a moment of stillness in my own apartment, thinking about the way the light hit her living room floor around 4 in the afternoon, or wondering whether the basil in her windowsill garden had finally sprouted. New leaves. I would see something at the grocery store, a new brand of tea, sunflower print on a mug, a jar of fig jam, and instinctively think of her, filing it away mentally as something I might bring next time. These weren't conscious decisions. They were habits of the heart, small gestures that grew from familiarity, and over time from something deeper I hadn't quite dared to name yet. I was still doing deliveries, still going through the routines of my daily job, but I was no longer just passing through people's lives. With Eleanor, I had stopped. One morning, I arrived to find her waiting outside with 2 packed lunches and a canvas tote bag. She handed it to me with a smile and said we were going on a picnic. She'd already chosen the spot, an old, quiet clearing just off a walking trail near the lake where she used to go when she needed to think. I didn't question it. I simply opened the car door for her, placed the tote in the back seat, and drove us both through winding roads that slowly unfolded into the soft blue shimmer of water and open sky. It wasn't far, maybe 30 minutes from town, but it felt like a world away. There was a stillness in the air, like even the wind had chosen to whisper rather than rush. We found a patch of shade beneath a large tree, laid out a blanket, and sat together in the dappled sunlight. Eleanor had packed sandwiches, chicken, salad with crisp lettuce, the kind that felt homemade and intentional. There were small containers of grapes, slices of cucumber, and 2 mason jars filled with lemonade she'd sweetened with honey. It was the kind of meal you prepare when you're trying to say something without saying it aloud. As we ate, we talked about everything and nothing. About the odd hummingbird that kept darting near her front porch. About a book I'd started and never finished. About how summer evenings always carried a kind of melancholy, like they already knew they wouldn't last. When we finished eating, we sat in silence for a while, letting the breeze carry the sounds of the lake and the distant rustle of other walkers along the trail. Then Eleanor did something she hadn't done before. She leaned her head gently against my shoulder. It was such a quiet gesture, so natural and unannounced, that it took me a few seconds to realize it had happened. I didn't move. I just let it be. Her presence was warm and familiar, and the closeness felt like a continuation of something that had already been building quietly between us. Like a story that didn't need a plot twist, just the slow accumulation of truth. Eventually she spoke, her voice barely louder than a breath. She said, "I used to think that kind of closeness only came once in a lifetime, and when it left, it never returned. But now, I'm not so sure." I didn't respond with words. Instead, I reached for her hand and held it gently. The way you hold something fragile not out of fear it will break, but out of reverence for what it survived. We sat like that for a long time, letting the moment stretch around us until the shadows shifted and the sun dipped low enough that the temperature began to fall. That evening, back at her house, she invited me in for tea as usual, but something in her manner had softened even more. There was no hesitation, no trace of that guarded pause she used to carry when I first started coming around. We moved easily together in the kitchen, preparing the tea, setting the mugs down, and choosing a playlist of old jazz songs she liked to hum along to. She didn't ask me to stay late, but she didn't need to. When the hour grew long and the house grew quiet again, she looked at me as I stood by the door and said, "You make this place feel lived in again." It wasn't just the word "zit," was the way she said them. Like someone rediscovering the language of connection after years of silence. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. My apartment felt too quiet, the walls too thin, the ceiling too close. I stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything, not just what had happened between us that day, but how it made me feel. I wasn't just caring for her, wasn't just providing company or kindness. I was becoming part of her healing, and she was becoming part of my belonging. There was a slow unfurling taking place, a return not to who we had been before, but to who we were still becoming together. Over the next week, our routine shifted again, though subtly. She began texting me not daily, but often enough to let me know she was thinking of me. Simple things, like a photo of her garden's first tomato, or a blurry shot of the sky just after it rained. I responded in kind, sending sketches from my notebook, a snap of my coffee mug with the words, "Guess what's in it?" or a quick video of the stray cat that had started hanging around the delivery warehouse. Our exchanges were light, but they built something, continuity, a shared narrative, a rhythm that was all ours. One afternoon, I brought over a surpriser set of watercolor paints. It's a brush set and a few sheets of thick paper. She had once told me she used to paint before life got too complicated. I figured maybe it was time to remember. She was hesitant at first, claiming she hadn't held a brush in over 30 years. But I reminded her that the garden hadn't bloomed for a long time either, and yet here it was. She laughed at that, a real laugh, and agreed to try. We painted that afternoon, nothing elaborate. It's just loose flowers and sky and whatever else came to mind. Our hands brushed once, and for a moment everything else faded, the ticking of the clock, the sounds from the street, the faint clinking of her wind chime outside. There was just us, and the soft sweep of color across paper, and the unspoken agreement that we were rewriting the script of what it meant to start again that evening. As I packed up the paints and prepared to leave, she asked if I could stay, just a bit longer. I sat back down without a word, and we watched the dusk gather outside the window. The room bathed in that golden twilight that makes everything feel like a memory before it even ends. I didn't need to speak. Neither did she.
Some silences aren't empty. They're full of trust.
Of presence, of the kind of quiet that says, "I'm glad you're here." It was nearing the end of July when Eleanor surprised me again, this time. Not with a picnic or a painting session, but with a question that felt heavier than anything she'd asked before. I had just arrived with a bag of her usual groceries bread. Eggs, a few cartons of oat milk, fresh herbs from the weekend market when she met me at the door, her hands dusted with flour and the faint smell of cinnamon in the air. She had been baking again, something I'd noticed she only did when her thoughts were too crowded to sit with. I followed her inside, set the groceries down, and before I could even comment on the scent wafting from the oven, she turned to me and said, not abruptly, but with quiet purpose, "Would you come with me to the cemetery tomorrow?" It wasn't what I expected. In all our time together, Eleanor had spoken of Thomas with openness, but never leaned too far into ceremony or tradition. Her grief had always felt like something she carried in her pocket, not flaunted, but never hidden. The idea that she wanted company for something so deeply personal struck me immediately, and I didn't hesitate. I nodded and told her I'd be there early, whatever time she needed. She gave me a small smile, the kind that didn't stretch across her face, but settled behind her eyes, and simply said, "Thank you." That night I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about what that visit would mean for her, and maybe even for me. It's easy to forget, in the middle of slow, comfortable moments, that every person is still navigating memories that shape them. I had come to know Eleanor not as a widow, but as a whole person, funny, clever, sometimes sharp, sometimes tender. But moments like this reminded me that her past still walked beside her every day. And now she was asking me to step into that space with her. The next morning was gray and cool, the kind of weather that held its breath. I arrived a little before 9, wearing my cleanest shirt and a pair of dark jeans, not formal, but respectful. Eleanor opened the door dressed in a navy blue blouse, simple pearl earrings, and a silk scarf around her neck. She looked elegant, dignified, and very much like someone walking into a memory. We didn't talk much on the drive. She gave quiet directions. Left here, then straight for a few miles, then a right past a row of cypress trees, and I followed them carefully, the road narrowing as we entered an older part of town I hadn't been through before. The cemetery was modest, tucked behind a grove of tall elms. The gate creaked when we opened it, and the gravel path crunched beneath our feet as we walked. Eleanor moved slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because each step carried weight. She led me toward a small plot near the edge, where the trees parted just enough to let the light through. The headstone was simple gray stone, polished smooth, with his name and the dates etched cleanly into the surface. Beneath that, a single line, "Always more laughter than silence." I stood a few paces back as she knelt beside it. She placed a hand on the stone, brushing off a few leaves, and pulled a single rose from her bag-deep red, trimmed perfectly, and set it down at the base. She stayed like that for a while, not crying, not speaking, just being. I didn't intrude. I didn't ask questions. I simply stood by, letting her presence speak for itself. When she finally stood, she turned to me with mist in her eyes, but a calm expression, and said, "I used to come here every year. On his birthday, on our anniversary, on the day he died. But then it got too hard. The memories became too sharp, so I stopped. But now I think it's time I came back, not out of obligation, but out of peace." We walked slowly back to the car, and as we did, she slipped her hand into mine. Had ever done that in public, and though no one else was around, it felt significant. Her fingers curled gently around mine, not seeking reassurance, but offering it. I squeezed her hand softly and didn't let go until we reached the car. On the drive back, she spoke more freely. Told me about how Thomas used to insist on dancing in the kitchen, even when there was no music. How he once tried to build a birdhouse and ended up with something the squirrels took over. How, after every argument, he'd write her a note and leave it in the fridge, knowing she'd find it while reaching for the milk. These weren't grand, sweeping stories, were pieces of a life, beautiful in their simplicity, profound in their normalcy. And as I listened, I felt honored. Not jealous, not uncertain, just honored to be trusted with them. That afternoon, we didn't return to her house. Instead, she asked if I wanted to walk by the lake, the same one where we'd had our picnic. We wandered slowly along the path, the water calm and the sky still pale with overcast clouds. Eventually, we sat on the same bench, facing the quiet ripples, and that's when she said it. "I haven't felt this way," she murmured, her eyes on the horizon, "since my husband died." I turned to her, startled not by the words, but by the vulnerability behind them. She wasn't trying to compare. She wasn't trying to erase what had been. She was naming what was happening now, giving voice to something that had been quietly blooming between us for weeks, maybe months. She looked at me then, her expression clear. "It's not the same. It's different, but it's real. And it matters." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My throat tightened, not from sadness, but from the enormity of the moment, because I knew exactly what she meant. Love doesn't always come wrapped in fireworks and declarations. Sometimes it comes in the form of shared routines, of unspoken understanding, of showing up again and again until presence itself becomes a promise. We sat like that until the wind picked up and the sky began to darken, when we finally rose. To leave, she reached for my hand again firmly. This time, and we walked together, not just side by side, but tethered by something that had grown not through grand gestures, but through countless quiet ones. There was something irrevocably different after that day by the lake. It wasn't a shift you could see from the outside, no dramatic kiss, no sudden announcement, no overnight transformation, but it lived in the spaces between everything Eleanor and I shared. It was in the way she stood a little closer when we talked, how our hands found each other more naturally when walking side by side. It was in the softness of her gaze when I spoke, like she wasn't just listening to my words, but memorizing them. Even in silence, the air between us felt warmer, more intentional, as though whatever had once been floating loosely around us had finally landed gently in both of our hands. We didn't have to speak of it again. That moment at the lake had said everything neither of us knew how to articulate. Love, for all its mystery and madness, had entered through the back door quietly, respectfully, and with all the grace of something that had waited patiently to be invited. Eleanor, called as the one to measure her movements with care, began surprising me more often. One Thursday morning, I arrived with her groceries, only to find a small card taped to the front door. It read, "Meet me in the garden. I've got something to show you." I found her kneeling in the farthest corner of the yard, digging into the dirt with a trowel, her floppy straw hat tipped over her brow. When she saw me, she grinned and motioned for me to come closer. She'd planted a new patch of lavender, and beside it, 3 wooden stakes marked with hand-painted signs, hope, stillness, and again. I crouched down beside her and read them aloud, my voice softer than I meant it to be. She explained that she wanted to grow things she could talk to, things that didn't require explanation or permission to bloom. Then she said, almost as an afterthought, that she'd left room for a 4th sign one I could name if I wanted to. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty patch of soil, unsure of what to call it, not because I lacked ideas, but because every word I thought of felt too small for what this place had come to mean. In time, Eleanor began inviting me into more than just her daily life. She took me to her book club one evening, a quiet group of women who met in a cozy sunroom filled with mismatched chairs and glasses of wine. They were kind to me, curious in a gentle way, and not at all surprised by my presence. One of them, a sprightly woman named June, with short white curls and a voice like velvet, leaned over during a discussion on character development and whispered, "We were wondering when she'd bring you along." I chuckled but said nothing, letting the words settle inside me like a confirmation I hadn't realized I'd needed. A few weekends later, Eleanor brought out a box of old photo albums. We sat on the living room floor while the ceiling fan spun lazily above us. The photos told the story of a life well-lived, vacations by the sea, Christmas mornings full of wrapping paper chaos, candid shots of Thomas with a childlike grin and flour on his nose, snapshots of Eleanor herself in her 20s, 30s, 40s, evolving frame by frame into the woman sitting beside me now. She laughed at some, teared up at others, and narrated the journey with the kind of fondness that only comes when the ache of loss has given way to the gift of memory. I didn't feel threatened by her past. In fact, I felt honored to witness it. Her love for Thomas wasn't a ghost haunting our space, it was a foundation, something that had shaped the kind of woman who could still open her heart after everything. And as I turned those pages with her, I began to feel the weight of what it meant to be welcomed into the full scope of someone's life, not just the present moment, but all the moments that came before. That night, as we closed the final album, Eleanor looked at me and said something I'll never forget. There was a time I thought love was behind me, that it had come and gone and left me with its shadows. But now, I see it differently. Love doesn't just arrive once. It shows up. In different clothes, in new voices, and sometimes in places you'd long stopped looking. I didn't say anything for a while. I just reached for her hand, which she gave freely. We sat there on the floor with the remnants of a whole life spread out around us like a mosaic messy. Colorful, beautiful, one evening, as autumn crept quietly into the air, I brought her a scarf. It was a deep plum color, soft and warm, the kind of shade I thought would complement the silver in her hair. She opened it slowly, almost reverently, and when she wrapped it around her shoulders, she smiled at me like I had handed her something more than fabric. "You notice things," she said. "The little things." Thomas did that too, and for the first time, the comparison didn't sting. It felt like a bridge and acknowledgement that I wasn't replacing anyone, but building something of my own. There was a night, sometime in early October, when we sat on her porch, as the wind picked up and leaves rustled down the street like soft applause. We'd finished a light dinner and she brought out a blanket, which we shared as we sipped warm cider. She leaned her head on my shoulder again, and this time I turned and kissed the top of her head without thinking. She didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her hand on my knee and whispered, "I didn't know if I'd ever feel peace again. But with you, I do." I closed my eyes for a moment and let her words wrap around me, certain that whatever had begun between us wasn't fragile, it was durable, slow-built, and quietly profound, and still. Despite all the deepening, there remained a gentleness in the way we navigated each other. We didn't rush to define what we were. We didn't stumble into declarations or get tangled in expectations. We simply kept showing up, listening more than speaking, learning each other's rhythm like a song without a chorus. Our connection wasn't born of urgency. It was the result of staying. It's coming back day after day, even when the world outside kept shifting and pulling and testing our resolve. One morning I arrived to find a note on her front step. It read, "In the garden. Don't knock. Just come." I followed the winding path through the side yard, past the rosemary and the late-blooming cosmos, and found her standing near the empty patch of soil where she'd left space for my sign. A wooden stake was already planted there, painted in. My own handwriting, though I hadn't touched it since that day, was the word belonging.
Oh.
I stared at it for a long time before I turned to her. She just smiled and said, "You said you didn't know what to name it, but I think you did. Just weren't ready yet." She was right. And as we stood there together, the wind brushing past us and the scent of lavender thick in the air, I knew with a quiet certainty that this, whatever it was, whatever it continued to become, was no longer a story of her grief or my solitude. It was ours now. It's grown not from emptiness, but from soil long left resting. And what we had planted, in its own steady, silent way, was beginning to bloom. The days grew shorter, and with them came a quiet shift in everything. The air turned crisper, the lights softer, and the neighborhood began to prepare for the slow retreat of fall. Halloween decorations popped up on fences, and the smell of wood smoke drifted lazily from nearby chimneys. It was the kind of season that asked people to turn inward, to draw the curtains early and linger longer over warm drinks and gentle conversations. For Eleanor and me, it became a time of deeper rituals. Casual visits became steadier, and our small gestures grew more meaningful. I found myself picking up her favorite scones without being asked. She started keeping an extra blanket on the porch swing for when I stayed past sunset. Without ever speaking the words aloud, we had crossed into a space that felt undeniably intimate, unromantic in a sweeping sense, but tender, deliberate, and real. One particular Saturday, a storm had settled in thick gray clouds rolling over the town like a slow tide, and the wind pushing leaves in frantic circles across the street. I hadn't planned to stop by, but I found myself pulling into her driveway anyway, my windshield wipers fighting the rain. When she opened the door, she didn't act surprised. She just stepped aside to let me in and said, "Good. I didn't want to spend this day alone." The power had flickered earlier. She had lit candles, small ones, and tea light holders scattered around the living room, their glow soft and flickering against the walls. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, and the warmth inside felt like a world apart from the storm outside. We sat in the living room, a pot of tea between us and an old radio playing static-filled jazz. Eleanor was wrapped in her plum scarf, the one I had given her, and I noticed that she wore it more often now, like a piece of comfort she could carry. The conversation moved slowly, winding between silence and memory. She told me stories from her childhood this time, how her father used to read aloud from the newspaper each morning, even the classifieds, just to make her laugh. How her mother, strict but loving, insisted on ironing even the dish towels. These weren't the grand stories she'd told before. These were smaller, deeper memories, the kind that form the roots of who someone becomes. Eventually, the power did go out. The lamps died with a click, and the room went still except for the rain and the low murmur of the wind. We didn't panic. We didn't even move. Eleanor reached for another candle and lit it with a match, the sudden flame dancing against her face in a way that made her look both older and younger all at once. "Funny," she said after a moment, "how we spend so much time trying to light up our lives with things, but it's the quiet moments like this where I feel the most seen." I didn't reply. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and in that dim room, I saw a woman who had lost much, endured much, and still chose to remain open. There was strength in that, and beauty. She stood and walked to the window, watching the rain drip in patterns down the glass. I followed, standing beside her, and we listened together to the rhythm of the storm. She spoke again, this time softer. When Thomas was alive, we'd spend days like this wrapped in a blanket, listening to the radio. He'd make up stories about the neighbors, and I'd laugh until I cried. She paused. I thought I'd never have that again, not the stories, but the feeling, the ease, the safety, the ... home of it. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound rehearsed or hollow, so I did the only thing I could think of. We reached behind me, grabbed the nearest throw blanket, and wrapped it around both of us. She laughed, a small, surprised sound, and leaned into me without hesitation. We stood there in silence, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in warmth, while the wind rattled the windows and the world outside spun its own chaos. Inside, there was only calm. Eventually, the rain began to lighten. The soft clatter of water against the roof faded into background noise. The power flickered back on, and the lamps hummed to life. But neither of us moved to blow out the candles. Their soft glow now felt like part of the moment, and we weren't ready to let it go. We sat back down, the blanket still around our shoulders, and Eleanor pulled out a deck of cards from a drawer. "We used to play gin rummy," she said, shuffling with practiced fingers. "He taught me when we were dating. Used to say he let me win, but I think I just got better than him." We played for hours, the scores tallied loosely on a napkin, both of us letting the game carry us through the evening. It wasn't about winning, it was about rhythm. It's the back and forth, the shared glances, the occasional burst of laughter, when one of us drew a terrible hand. And somewhere between the third and fourth round, she reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Not for long, just long enough to remind me that we were here together in the flickering light, choosing not just to pass the time but to share it, as I left that night. The storm had completely passed, leaving the air smelling clean and the pavement slick with reflections of the street lamps. Eleanor walked me to the door, her hand lingering on the frame as she watched me put on my jacket. "Thank you for today," she said. "You made the storm feel ... welcomed." I smiled at her, not knowing how to describe what I felt, except to say, "You've taught me that stillness can be just as powerful as motion." And then I left, driving through puddles and empty streets. The image of her standing in that candlelit room etched into my mind. I didn't know where things were heading. We hadn't spoken about us in any definitive terms. But in that moment, I didn't need clarity. What we had was growing, not by force, but by quiet commitment. A series of shared storms and silences, and I was no longer afraid of the unknown. Not when I had found something so certain in her presence. The calm after the storm lingered in the air for days, as though the world itself had taken a breath and decided to hold it just a little longer. Eleanor and I fell back into a rhythm, a gentle one made of unspoken habits and carefully held routines. The kind you don't realize you've built until you miss them. She'd begun sending me little reminders, not requests exactly, but soft invitations. A message about a new bread recipe she wanted to try. A photo of her garden now littered with golden leaves, or a simple "if you're not too busy, stop by." I always did. The house felt warmer these days. Maybe it was the season, or maybe it was her, or maybe it was the way she had slowly opened the space to me so fully that my presence no longer felt like an addition, but an extension of what had always been meant to fit there. I had stopped thinking of our time together in terms of visits. It no longer felt like I was dropping in, it felt like I was arriving. There was a marked difference between the two, one I hadn't noticed until Eleanor pointed it out one evening as we stood in her kitchen, washing dishes. I had offered to help dry, and she handed me a warm plate and said, "You don't hover, you just move with the place. It's like you know where everything belongs." It was one of the kindest things anyone had ever said to me. About romance or affection. It was about understanding, about fitting into a life without needing to rearrange it. One morning, I arrived to find her sitting at the dining table, a stack of old papers spread out in front of her, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her elbow. She was staring at something, a folded envelope sealed with a small faded sticker in the shape of a sunflower. When she looked up, her eyes held something I hadn't seen in a while, not sadness exactly, but that particular weight that comes from carrying a memory too long without opening it. She gestured for me to sit, and I did, watching her fingers move over the edge of the envelope as though trying to decide whether it still held power over her or not. "It's a letter I wrote to myself the year after Thomas passed. I don't even remember everything I put in it. I told myself I'd read it again when I felt ready to start over, to begin something new." She looked at me then, her voice almost breaking. I kept putting it off year after year. And now I think I finally might be ready. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she asked me if I'd mind walking with her down the street, just a few blocks, to a little park she used to visit. Went, the envelope tucked into her coat pocket like a quiet companion. The sky was overcast, but not unfriendly. The trees were losing their leaves in slow spirals, the benches along the path damp from a morning mist. We walked in silence for a while, our steps sinking naturally as the gravel crunched beneath our shoes. When we reached the far side of the park, she sat down on a bench and took a deep breath before pulling the envelope out and placing it in my hands. "Would you read it?" she asked, her voice low. "I want to hear it, but I don't want to be the one to say it." I opened it carefully, unfolding the paper like it was made of something older than time. The handwriting was hers, a little shakier, more uncertain than the note she scribbled now, but still undeniably Eleanor. The letter was addressed to me, "When I'm ready," and it began with a line that made my throat catch. "If you're reading this, I hope you found something that doesn't scare you." The rest of the letter spoke of grief, of guilt, of the strange loneliness that follows loss like a shadow, but also of hope. She had written about wanting to laugh again, to wake up and not feel the weight first thing in the morning, to touch someone's hand and not flinch. She wrote about Thomas, not just his absence, but his presence in her habits, in the way she folded laundry. In the quiet lullabies she sometimes hummed while cooking, and then, at the end, she wrote one final sentence, one that felt like it had waited years to be heard. "If there's someone by your side, someone who listens without needing to fix you, someone who lets you be who you are now instead of who you used to be, hold on to them." I looked up from the letter and saw Eleanor watching me, tears at the corners of her eyes, but no shame in them. She wasn't fragile in that moment. She was the strongest I'd ever seen her. I handed the letter back, and she took it gently, folded it once more, and placed it in her coat pocket. Then, without a word, she leaned into me, her head resting against my shoulder, and together we sat in the cool autumn stillness, the world moving quietly around us. In the days that followed, something began to shift against small, almost imperceptible changes. Like the way she started using "we" more often than I, when she talked about plans. Should make that apple tart next weekend. We could visit the holiday market when it opens. They were tiny slips, but they held weight. We were slowly becoming not just to people who spent time together, but to people building a shared rhythm, a shared future, even if it was unspoken. One evening, she invited me to help decorate for the upcoming season. Her attic was filled with old boxes marked with fading labels. Autumn, winter, miscellaneous. We spent the better part of an afternoon sorting through them, untangling lights, brushing off garlands, and unwrapping ornaments packed in tissue paper. She showed me one that Thomas had made a crooked star cut from felt and glitter, so old it was barely holding together. He insisted it go on the tree every year, she said, smiling softly. Even when we got new ones, said it reminded him of our first Christmas, when we had no money and made everything by hand. I asked her if she wanted to put it up again this year. She nodded. Yes, she said, but only if we put something new beside it, something ours. So I made something, a simple wooden heart, carved and sanded smooth, with our initials painted on the front. She didn't cry when I gave it to her. She just pressed it to her chest and whispered, "Thank you for helping me remember that beginnings don't erase what came before. They just make space for what's next." That night, after we'd finished decorating and were sitting in the soft light of the tree, Eleanor turned to me and asked, "What would you have told yourself a year ago if you knew this was coming?" I thought for a long moment before answering. That healing isn't a destination. It's a room with a window. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone shows up to sit in it with you. She reached for my hand. "I'm glad you're here." And in that quiet, lamplit room, full of the past and the present, woven gently together, I knew with all the certainty I'd ever felt that I wasn't going anywhere. It was just after Thanksgiving when I noticed the light in Eleanor's home began to change, not the light from the sky, but the light within her. There was a warmth that didn't flicker the way it used to, steadiness to her movements, to her laughter, even to the way she brewed her tea in the morning. She still hummed that old melody under her breath when she cooked, still scolded the squirrels who danced too boldly along her garden fence, but now she did it with a rhythm that suggested the pieces of her life were finally aligning again. Not perfectly, not without their jagged edges, but enough to feel whole. I saw it most in the mornings when I'd drop by earlier than expected and find her already reading by the window. The scarf I gave her draped around her shoulders, the teacup in her hand resting just so. She looked settled, not settled into routine or into grief, but into herself. We'd started making Saturday breakfasts a tradition by then. It began with her making cinnamon rolls on a whim one morning and me offering to bring fresh fruit and eggs the next. Somehow we kept it, going week after week, alternating who cooked and who cleaned, who set the table, and who picked the music. The mornings were slow and unrushed, filled with soft jazz or old folk songs, windows open to let in the scent of leaves or rain, depending on the week. It wasn't about the food. It was about starting the weekend together, quietly acknowledging that the day didn't feel quite right unless it began in that kitchen. On one of those mornings, as I was slicing apples for a tart she wanted to try, she pulled an old worn envelope from the drawer near the fridge. She placed it beside me on the counter and said, "You might want to read this before December comes." I glanced at her and she gave a small smile before turning back to her mixing bowl. I wiped my hands and opened the envelope slowly, recognizing the paper immediately. It was a letter not handwritten, but type dated 5 years earlier. It was from her attorney, a will, neatly organized and concise, with my name appearing near the bottom in a section titled Personal Wishes. She had written, long ago, that if she ever met someone who made her feel safe again, someone who brought joy to her garden and laughter to her walls, she wanted them to have the photographed old framed image of her and Thomas beneath the oak tree where they used to picnic, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that second chapters don't diminish first ones. I looked up at her, and she shrugged. "I had it updated recently. I don't plan on going anywhere anytime soon." She said, "But life doesn't always ask for permission." I nodded, unsure what to say, but deeply moved by the gesture. It wasn't about the photograph, it was about the trust it carried. The space she had made for me, not only in her present, but in the legacy of her life. Later that afternoon, we decided to drive out to the tree in the photograph, a towering oak that stood a few miles out of town in a quiet, open field once used for school picnics and family reunions. Eleanor hadn't been there in years, not since before Thomas passed. But she remembered the turn-off road and the cracked wooden sign that pointed toward the open clearing. The grass was short, the field wind swept in silent, the oak still standing. Tall, with its sprawling arms stretched wide like it had been waiting. She brought a blanket, and I carried a thermos of hot cider. Didn't say much as we sat beneath the tree. Just watched the clouds move across the sky like slow ships, carrying time along with them. Eleanor told me then about the first time she and Thomas had kissed her out under that very tree. It was the 4th of July, and the town had gathered for a potluck and fireworks. They'd wandered off to find a quieter spot, and in the hush before the show began, he'd leaned in and kissed her. Not urgently, not dramatically, but as if sealing a secret between the two of them. She laughed when she said it. It wasn't even that great of a kiss, she admitted, but it was honest. Then turning to me, her smile softened. You kiss differently. It feels like a promise. I reached for her hand, lacing my fingers with hers, and we sat in the hush of the field, the only sounds the rustling of dried leaves and the distant call of a hawk. That moment under the oak was something I wouldn't forget, not because it was grand, but because it was real. It felt like we had finally named what had been growing all this time between us. Love that didn't erase what came before, but added to it. Love that honored grief without becoming its shadow. As December approached, Eleanor grew more playful. She insisted we get a tree knot, a tiny artificial one for the corner, but a real one, the kind that left pine needles all over the floor and smelled like winter. We visited a tree farm together, wandering through rows of evergreens, laughing at the crooked ones and arguing good-naturedly about height and symmetry. We finally chose one slightly too tall for her ceiling. But she said that was perfect because love should always feel just a little too big. Decorating it was an event. We played holiday music on our old record player and drank mulled wine as we unwrapped ornaments collected over decades. She told stories, with each one a ceramic dove from their honeymoon in Charleston, a silver bell gifted by a friend who passed long ago, a paper angel made by her niece when she was 5. Then she handed me the heart I had carved and asked me to place it high, just below the star. Let's start new traditions, she said, but keep the old ones close. It was that night, as we sat together in the soft glow of the lights, that she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, I used to think I'd only ever belonged to one love story. But maybe there's more than one way to be chosen. I didn't respond right away, just wrapped my arm around her, pulled her close, and breathed in the scent of pine and cinnamon and something unnameable, something like peace. The snow came early that year, light at first, then heavier, blanketing the world in a hush. Eleanor's home became a refuge, a sanctuary of warmth and light against the cold. We began spending nearly every evening together, sometimes cooking, sometimes reading, sometimes simply being still. There were no labels, no declarations, just two people who had weathered their own storms and found in each other the quiet clarity of companionship. And as the world outside turned white and the fire crackled in the hearth, I realized something I hadn't dared let myself believe before. We were not waiting for anything. We were already living the story. The snow didn't let up for days, turning the neighborhood into a canvas of white, soft and soundless, muffling the usual hum of life outside. Eleanor's street, usually active with dog walkers, and the thump of newspaper deliveries had grown still. It was the kind of stillness that asks you to turn inward, to slow down, to wrap your life in thick socks and wool blankets and pause. Inside her home, time didn't feel so linear anymore. The days blended gently together, marked not by appointments or tasks, but by small rituals. Morning tea, a crossword puzzle we half solved together, long stares out the window, watching birds flit through bare branches. It felt like we were inside a snow globe, our world held gently between seasons and moments. Unshaken and protected from everything that once felt urgent, we began spending the nights together more often, though not in the way that might sound. There was no rush to change the nature of what we had into something more expected or labeled. Some nights I would fall asleep on the couch after a movie. I'd wake up to find a blanket tucked around me and the lights turned low. Other nights she would fall asleep with a book in her lap, glasses askew, and I'd gently remove them, careful not to wake her, content just to be there beside her. And on a few rare nights, when the wind howled and the house creaked with cold, she would ask me, almost shyly, to stay in her bed, not with desire or tension, but for the simple comfort of being close to someone. And we did just that, lay side by side, our backs warm against one another, breathing in tandem. It was a closeness that didn't need anything else to make it complete. One morning, after such a night, I awoke before her. The sky outside was a soft gray blue, the kind that comes before a fresh snowfall. I watched her sleep for a moment, her hair a silver halo against the pillow, her face so calm it was almost childlike. I realized then how deeply I had come to love her. Not in a way that flared or demanded or even needed to be declared, but in a way that had woven itself into every part of my days. It was in how I moved through her home, how I stocked her favorite tea without needing a reminder, how I caught myself humming her tune when I was alone. Love in its truest form had arrived without spectacle. It had grown steadily, gently, and now it simply was like air, like light, like gravity. When Eleanor awoke, she turned to me and smiled. "You're still here," she said, her voice thick with sleep. And I replied simply, "Of course I am." That seemed to be enough for her. She closed her eyes again and rested a hand lightly on my chest, and we stayed like that for a long while. The silence between us so complete it felt sacred. In the following days, we began preparing for Christmas. It wasn't a grand production, no big parties or flashing lights, but there was something magical in its simplicity. We baked cookies and mailed out cards to her distant relatives, addressed in her careful handwriting with my assistance on the stamps. She insisted on wrapping every gift herself, even though her fingers complained after a few hours. I offered to help only to be handed scissors with a firm warning. No crooked edges, or it doesn't count. Eleanor had a special box of ornaments that only came out once every few years. Inside were delicate glass bulbs, hand-painted figurines, an old porcelain angel that had once topped her parents' tree. She let me place the angel this time, balancing on a step stool while she directed me from below, laughing every time I tilted it slightly off-center. There was joy in her voice. Not just the quiet happiness I had come to know, but the kind that comes from remembering and choosing to celebrate what still remains. It struck me how brave that was, to not turn away from joy after loss, but to lean into it, even when it arrived differently than before. One evening, just a few days before Christmas, we received a surprise visitor. It was her neighbor, Ruth, a widow in her late 70s who had known Eleanor for decades. Ruth brought over a casserole, claiming it was too much for one old lady, but the glint in her eye told me it was more than that. She stayed for tea, and the three of us sat by the fire sharing stories. At one point, Ruth looked between us and said, "You know, it's a beautiful thing to find someone who fits into your rhythm after all these years. Most people give up the dance before they hear the music again." Eleanor smiled but said nothing, simply reached for my hand and held it, not for Ruth's benefit, not for mine, but because it felt right. Later that night, after Ruth had left and the house had quieted again, Eleanor said, "She's right, you know. I thought I'd finished dancing, but you walked in with your deliveries and turned my kitchen into a ballroom." I laughed, but there were tears in my eyes. I had never been told something so beautiful, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do with it but hold it carefully in my heart. On Christmas morning, I arrived early. I had wrapped her present carefully in old leather-bound book of poetry I had found at a used bookstore, the kind she once mentioned loving as a girl. Inside the cover I had written a line, "For the woman who reminded me that winter can still bring bloom." She opened it slowly, touching the spine like it was a living thing. When she read the inscription, she closed the book and placed her hand over her heart, nodding once before leaning over and kissing my cheek. "You listen," she whispered. "That's the greatest gift anyone's ever given me." We spent the day quietly, opening small gifts, making lunch together, taking a walk. Through the snowy lane behind her house, the world felt paused, wrapped in white and peace. That evening, as we sat by the fire, she asked me what my favorite part of the day had been. I told her it was this moment, now quiet, warm, shared. She smiled and said, "Mine too. Every year. I used to dread this day. Now it feels like coming home." And that was what it had become. Home. Not a place, not even a house, but the feeling of being known, accepted, and wanted not, in spite of everything, but because of it. We had found a way to be together that honored both the past and the present, a way that didn't erase anything but made space for what could still be. That night, before I left, she walked me to the door like she always did. The snow had started. Again, fine and glimmering under the porch light. She reached up, straightened the scarf around my neck and said, "Drive safe, and come back soon." I leaned in, kissed her softly and said, "You'll see me tomorrow." And I meant it, because by then I knew. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't passing. This wasn't just a season we'd remember fondly. This was the beginning of a different kind of forever. The days after Christmas fell into a kind of peaceful drift, where time didn't press forward with urgency but rather lingered like a candle's last flickering light. Eleanor and I fell into deeper ease, deeper silence, the kind that's never awkward, but settled, full of comfort and unspoken understanding. There was a kind of rhythm to us now that didn't need checking or confirming. It came and went freely, not out of obligation, but because her home had started to feel like the quiet center of my life. The place I gravitated toward even when I had nowhere to be. She never asked me where I'd been when I arrived late, and I never had to knock when I entered early. We simply existed with each other, in a space that no longer required explanation. January arrived with a hush of snow and a sharpness in the air that turned breath into clouds. We celebrated the new year alone, just the two of us, drinking cider by the fire while the world celebrated loudly beyond her walls. At midnight, there were no fireworks, no champagne, just the two of us sitting close, holding hands, and acknowledging what had changed between us and what hadn't. It was the quietest new year I had ever experienced, and somehow the most meaningful. She whispered to me then, as the old year passed, this time last year. I didn't think I'd still be here, let alone laughing again, and I understood, because I hadn't expected this either. Not this feeling of peace, not the way it had all become so natural, but as the days of the new year passed, something in Eleanor began to shift, not emotionally, not between us, but physically. At first, it was smaller hand that trembled as she stirred her tea, a slight wince when she bent to pick something up. I noticed, though she tried to hide it. I asked once, gently, and she brushed it off with a tired smile and a wave of her hand. "It's just winter," she said. "My joints have always hated the cold." But I knew her well enough by now to hear what she didn't say. Her pauses were heavier, her laugh a little thinner, still present, still beautiful, but tired, in a way that ran deeper than just the season. Then came the morning when I found her sitting in the kitchen, fully dressed but unmoving, her hands folded tightly on the table, her eyes distant. There was a stillness in her that I didn't like, a fragile kind of silence. She turned to me slowly and said, "I think I need to go see my doctor." There was no panic in her voice, no fear, just resignation, the quiet decision of someone who knew her body better than anyone else. I nodded, offered to take her, and she didn't refuse. The visit was calm. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, and we sat side by side flipping through magazines without really reading. She kept her hand near mine, her fingers occasionally brushing my arm, and though we said little, the gravity of the moment was undeniable. When they called her in, she gave me a small smile, squeezed my hand once, and disappeared behind the door. I waited. I watched the clock, and I tried not to let my mind wander too far ahead. She came back out after almost an hour, her face unreadable. We didn't speak until we were back in the car, the heater humming quietly. Then she said, "There's a small mass in my lung. They don't know yet if it's dangerous, but they're concerned." She looked out the window as if the clouds held the next line she was supposed to say. "I'm not scared," she added softly. "Not really. I'm just tired of losing things." I didn't know what to say, so I reached over and took her hand. Not the trembling one, her right, but the steadier left. I held it until she looked at me, and I said, "You're not losing me. Not with panic, not with panic, not with grief, but with the kind of tears that come from knowing someone means it, really means it. And for the first time in a long while, I saw her let go just a little and lean fully into someone else's strength. The next few weeks were quiet. She went through tests and scans, appointments and referrals. I drove her when she let me, sat in waiting rooms reading old books while she met with specialists, picked up her prescriptions and made her meals whether she asked or not. Eleanor didn't want to make a fuss. "Don't start treating me like glass," she said more than once. But she didn't resist the comfort. She let me put my arm around her when she was cold. Let me run the bath when her joints ached. Let me read to her at night when her eyes were too tired to focus. These weren't grand gestures. They were the soft, everyday kind. It's the kind that say you're not alone, louder than any declaration ever could. We never used the word love out loud. It hung there, always, in the space between sentences. In the way she paused to let me finish her thoughts. In the way I memorized the placement of every tea tin in her cupboard. In the way we watched the sun set from the back porch in silence. Knowing the other was already thinking the same thing, love didn't need to be said. It was lived. The diagnosis came at the end of January, stage 1. Caught early, operable, manageable, and in that there was relief, cautious, tender relief. Eleanor took the news with the same graceful strength she carried in everything she did.
Oh.
"Not afraid of dying," she said to me later that evening. "Afraid of not living, but I don't feel that way anymore. Not since you." We stood in the kitchen, the smell of roasted vegetables filling the room, her hand resting on mine as she cut bread. It was such an ordinary moment, and yet it felt extraordinary because we were in it fully. That night, we didn't speak much. We simply held each other, long and quiet, in the space between what had been feared and what had been given a second. Chance, I held her as if she might vanish, and she held me as if I might anchor her to this life. And perhaps we were both right in our own ways. The next morning, Eleanor woke before me. I found her in the garden, boots on, breath puffing in the cold air, scattering birdseed beneath the bare branches of the tree she loved most. When I called out to her, she turned, and with the sun rising behind her, she smiled, not a smile of triumph. One of relief, but one of quiet certainty. She had chosen life again. She's chosen mornings and winters and the smell of pine. She's chosen all of it. And I realized in that moment, as I walked toward her, that love doesn't always shout its arrival. "You're ready to believe in it again, February?" settled in like a whisper. Its days short and soft, dressed in cold light and the quiet promise that spring was somewhere ahead, even if not yet visible. The worst of the snow had passed, and in its place came frost-lined mornings and afternoons colored in dull silvers and pale golds. Eleanor, never one to linger too long in sorrow, began to move differently again. The burden of uncertainty had not left her entirely, but with the diagnosis clear and a plan in place, her steps seemed steadier, her voice warmer. We started walking again, short, cautious strolls down her street, arm in arm, our breaths drifting like small ghosts behind. U.S. These walks became our new ritual, a time for unhurried conversation. For observations about crooked fences and squirrels with bold personalities, for simply being as her surgery date approached. I noticed her begin to take stock of things, not dramatically, not with panic, but with a sort of graceful inventory. She spent a full afternoon organizing the bookshelves in the living room, pulling out volumes she hadn't touched in years, some of which she passed to me without explanation, others she tucked back like secret treasures. I asked once if she was preparing for something, and she smiled without answering, simply pressing a worn paperback into my hands and saying, "You'll like this one. It's quiet and sad and hopeful, like life." I began sleeping over more regularly, and she stopped pretending that it was only because of the cold or the snow. It was unspoken, but understood. We both needed it. On one of those nights, I woke, up to find her already awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was still except for the sound of the wind brushing against the window panes. She didn't turn to look at me, only whispered into the dark, "I didn't think I'd ever let someone see me afraid again." I reached out for her hand, and she took it. We lay there like that for a long time, tethered by that small connection. Her fear and my silent promise braided together in the quiet, in preparation for her surgery. She asked if I would take her to the hospital and stay through the night afterward. There was no hesitation in my answer. The morning of the procedure was still and gray. We drove in silence, Eleanor looking out the window, her hands folded in her lap. She had dressed in layers, her favorite green scarf tucked around her neck, the one her sister had given her years ago. She wasn't nervous, not in the way most people are. She was calm, reflective, and beneath it all, radiated a strength I had come to admire in every gesture she made. At the hospital, the pre-op room smelled like antiseptic and low-burning anxiety. I sat with her as she answered the nurse's questions, signed the forms, and handed over her wedding ring to be kept safe. As they wheeled her away, she looked at me once, and there was a flicker of something between us. Not desperation, not fear, but a kind of trust that needed no words. I carried that look with me into the waiting room, where I sat for hours flipping through my thoughts instead of magazines, my hands restless, my heart tight but hopeful. The surgery went well. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. When she woke, she was groggy and pale, but her first word was my name, and I nearly broke down right there. I stayed by her side all night, sitting in the uncomfortable hospital chair, watching her breathe, brushing hair from her forehead when she shifted. Around 3 a.m., she opened her eyes briefly, reached for my hand, and said, "You stayed." I nodded. "I always will." Recovery was slow. Pain crept in at odd moments, and fatigue became her most stubborn companion. But Eleanor faced it all with quiet resolve, never complaining, never asking for more than she needed. I became her shadow making meals, managing her medications, helping her in and out of chairs when the soreness flared too sharp. She called me her nurse once, and I corrected her gently. "I'm just someone who loves you." She didn't say anything then, only looked at me with eyes full of everything we never needed to explain. By March, she was strong enough to walk further again, took longer paths through the neighborhood, stopping to watch children play or to inspect budding crocuses, poking their heads through the thawing soil. Spring was still more memory than presence, but it was coming, and we could feel it. There was something poetic about the timing her healing coinciding with the earth's own slow return to color. It made everything feel deliberate, as if life itself had chosen to mirror her recovery. One day, while cleaning out an old drawer, she handed me a stack of photographs bound together with twine. "These are the ones I couldn't look at for years," she said. They were pictures of her and Thomas Young, in love, building a life. Wedding photos, vacations, holidays, quiet moments caught by film and preserved like pressed flowers. We sat together on the couch, flipping through them. And as she told me stories, some sweet, some difficult, I felt no jealousy, no comparison, only gratitude. Gratitude that she had known great love before, and that somehow her heart had still made space for me. Eventually, we reached a photo of Eleanor standing on a cliff by the ocean, wind tearing through her hair, eyes closed, arms open. "That's when I felt most free," she said. "Right there, before all the weight came in." I studied her face in the photo, and then I looked at her sitting beside me, older, wiser, scarred but strong. "Do you feel free now?" I asked gently. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Getting there, and that was enough, more than enough." As April crept closer and the days grew longer, we started to talk about the future in more concrete terms. Not big declarations, not wedding plans or dramatic shifts, but practical, simple things. Whether she should sell the car she rarely used, whether I should move some of my things into the guest room permanently, whether we might take a short trip once her strength returned to coastal town, maybe, or the lake she always spoke of. These conversations weren't framed in ifs anymore. They were grounded in when. One evening after dinner, we sat on the back porch watching the sun sink low behind the trees. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender, and the air smelled faintly of rain and earth. Eleanor turned to me and said, "You know, I've stopped thinking of time as something I'm running out of. I just think of it as something I get. To share with you." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I reached over, took her hand, and kissed the back of it gently. And in that moment, I felt something deep and unshakable, settle in my chest. A kind of quiet promise not made aloud. It's not signed or sworn but lived, because the truth was this: life hadn't given us what we'd expected. It had taken things from us, broken us in places, tested our softness. But in return, it had offered something rare and breathtaking. A second bloom, love that came later, slower, wiser, and maybe, just maybe, stronger for it. April arrived with a kind of cautious optimism, as if nature itself understood the fragility of hope. After a long winter, the mornings were still cold, but the light had changed. It came earlier and stayed longer, casting golden streaks across Eleanor's kitchen tiles by 7 a.m., illuminating dust motes and small things that had gone unnoticed in the gray months before. She had a small vase on the windowsill now, always full of something: daffodils, hyacinths, even a sprig of forsythia, once flowers I picked up on my way to see her. Half out of habit, half out of the ache to see her smile when I handed them over. We never said much about the flowers, but every time she arranged them, I knew it was her quiet way of saying she saw me, that I mattered, that I was part of her world in ways neither of us had expected. Her strength was returning bit by bit. At first, it was just standing longer in the kitchen without needing to sit down. Then it was taking stairs one at a time instead of two. Then walking to the corner store without needing to lean against my arm the whole way. There was pride in her eyes every time she accomplished something small, and I never once tried to diminish those victories by suggesting they were expected. I treated them like what they were: miracles stitched from perseverance and grace. There were still days she was tired, of course. Days when the morning came too quickly, when her chest felt tight or her joints heavy. On those days, I'd make tea without asking, slip her favorite blanket over her shoulders, and sit beside her with a book or soft music until the quiet no longer felt like surrender, but rest. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching a robin build its nest in the tree by the gate, she turned to me with a look that stopped my breath short. It wasn't sadness or fear or even love in the way I'd come to recognize it. It was something deeper. Resolve, perhaps, or acceptance. "There's something I want to do," she said, her voice calm but purposeful. "Something I've put off for too long." I waited. I had learned not to press her when her mind was working. She took a long breath, then said, "I want to go back to the coast. One last time. To that cliff." I knew the one she meant immediately, the one in the photograph, where her younger self stood against the wind, arms open to the world. "Not to say goodbye," she added, "not to see who I am now, standing in the same place." The idea sat with me all night, not heavy, but large. I thought about what it would take: the drive, the accommodations, the care she would need along the way. And more than that, the emotional toll of returning to a place steeped in memory. But I also understood something else. She wasn't chasing ghosts. She wasn't trying to relive a life already lived. She wanted to reclaim something, that image of herself, that moment of freedom. She wanted to step back into it, not as a woman in mourning, but as one who had survived, so we planned it. Slowly, carefully, like two people packing for something holy. Eleanor made lists: what to bring, where to stop, which route avoided the steepest hills. I called ahead to a small Badan breakfast perched near the cliffs, the kind of place with white curtains and salt in the wood. The owner remembered her, surprisingly. She and her husband used to come every summer, the woman said over the phone. She always wore a red sun hat and ordered chamomile tea with honey. I didn't tell Eleanor about that call, just tucked the detail into my chest, another thread in the tapestry of who she'd been and who she was becoming again. We set off on a Thursday, the sun glinting through the windshield as we drove out of town. She sat beside me in a blue cardigan, hair pulled back, sunglasses perched on her nose. There was a quiet joy in her posture, a kind of forward-leaning anticipation I hadn't seen in her since before the diagnosis. The drive took most of the day, winding through hills and valleys that were just beginning to blush with spring. We didn't talk much, but the silence between us was alive, filled with soft music, shared glances, the occasional squeeze of her hand over the gear shift. When we arrived at the inn, the owner greeted her like an old friend. "You haven't Changed, she said, and Eleanor laughed in that low, musical way she did when surprised by kindness. The room was small but lovely, overlooking the sea. We unpacked slowly, carefully, and then sat on the balcony watching the waves crash against the rocks far below. She reached for my hand and held it for a long time without speaking. When she finally did, she whispered, "This is where I let go the first time. Now I think maybe it's where I'll begin again." The next morning, just after sunrise, we walked to the cliff. It was colder than I expected, the wind sharper, but she didn't flinch. She moved with purpose, each step deliberate, her breath steady despite the incline. When we reached the edge, she stood still for a long time, facing the ocean, eyes closed. I stayed a few steps back, letting her have the moment, but ready to catch her if the wind or the memory pulled too hard. Eventually, she opened her eyes, stepped forward, and lifted her arms, just like in the photo. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look on her face told me everything. Peace, release, reclamation. She stayed like that for several minutes before lowering her arms and turning back to me. "It's different now," she said, walking toward me. "But it's still beautiful." We embraced, not out of sadness or nostalgia, but because we were there, alive, together, facing the sea and all that it represented. Back at the inn, we spent the rest of the day sipping tea and reading by the window, watching the sky shift from blue to gold to gray. That night, lying beside her in the small bed, I'd listened to her breathing and thought about how far we'd come, not in distance, but in the journey of our hearts. What had started as a grocery delivery had become something sacred. A slow, patient unraveling of pain, stitching of new dreams. She whispered to me then, eyes half closed, "I didn't think anyone would ever see me fully again, but you did.
Yes.
And you didn't turn away." I kissed her forehead and replied, "You saw me too. Even the parts I didn't know needed seeing." And in the quiet that followed, I understood something deeper than any vow or promise. Love, when true, doesn't rush. It doesn't demand. It stays. It listens. It grows in silence and flowers, in the smallest gestures. And as I drifted to sleep beside her, the sound of the waves whispering through the cracked window, I realized I was no longer waiting for the next chapter. I was living it, right there, in that moment. With her, we stayed by the coast for 3 more days. They were the kind of days that slip through your fingers like silk soft, slow, sun-drenched in places, and fogged over in others. Eleanor and I spent them not in search of excitement or stories to bring home, but in the quiet absorption of being fully present with one another. We took morning walks along the damp shore, the sand still cool beneath our shoes, her arm occasionally slipping through mine, her silence as full as any conversation. When the wind picked up, we'd retreat to the inn's small sunroom, where the tea was always warm and the windows framed the sea like an ever-changing painting. I read aloud from the poetry book I'd once given her. Sometimes she'd close her eyes as I read, as if the words could stitch back pieces of time, soften old griefs, and hold this new chapter in place. There was one morning, just before sunrise, when I woke to find her already up, standing at the window, her silhouette outlined by the first light of dawn. I watched her for a moment before speaking, knowing instinctively this wasn't just a moment, it was the moment, the one where everything quiets and everything becomes clear. She turned slowly when she heard me stir and smiled in that way she did when she'd been lost in memory, but returned by love. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about how love used to feel like lightning sudden, consuming. But with you, it feels like sunlight constant, warm, and always finding its way in." It hit me then what we'd really built together. Not just companionship, not a replacement for what she had lost, not a temporary fix to a season of loneliness. We had grown something different, something deeper. It wasn't about grand passion or dramatic declarations. It was about presence. It was about how I knew to pass her the honey without her asking, or how she'd warm my coat by the radiator before we went out. It was about the shared hum of living together, each day becoming a thread in a quilt we hadn't realized we were making. When we returned to town, spring had fully arrived. The trees that once stood bare now hummed with color. Eleanor's garden, which I had begun tending in small ways during the colder months, was beginning to bloom again. She walked through it slowly that first morning back, touching each new sprout with reverence, her fingers brushing leaves like the pages of an old book rediscovered. "It's funny," she said. "Everything feels new, but also exactly how it's supposed to be." Her recovery continued steadily, and with it, so did the rhythm of our life. We moved through the days with a kind of gentle certainty. Grocery runs turned into walks through the farmer's market, where she'd pick up fresh herbs and smile at the vendors who knew her by name. I took on a few more deliveries through the same service where we'd met, though never as many as before. My heart wasn't in the running anymore. It was in the arriving and being home. Home by then was wherever she was. One afternoon a letter arrived. It was from her late husband's niece, inviting Eleanor to a family gathering in the summer. She hadn't been in years. "Too many ghosts," she told me once. This time, she didn't put the invitation away. She left it on the table, next to the sugar bowl, as if letting the idea linger before deciding. Later that evening, I saw her holding it, fingers curled loosely around the edges. "I think I'll go," she said finally, "and I want you to come with me. Not to replace what was, but to show them what is." We went, and though the gathering held its fair share of awkward introductions and curious glances, there was a strange and beautiful peace in it. People welcomed me not with suspicion, but with warmth. They could see, even if unspoken, that Eleanor was not grieving anymore, at least not in the way that paralyzes or silences. She was living fully, and I was simply part of the life she had built back for herself. That night, as we lay in the guest room of her cousin's home, she reached over and ran her fingers along the inside of my palm, the way she always did when she wanted to say something, but hadn't quite found the words. She whispered, "I used to think my story had already been written, that I was just turning pages in a book that was already ending." She paused, her fingers tracing gentle circles now. "But then you showed up, not like a new chapter, but like someone handing me a pen." I kissed her hand, not needing to say anything else, because I knew exactly what she meant. And the beauty of it all was that I felt the same. Months passed, then seasons. The heat of summer faded into the crisp amber of fall. And through it all, we remained. Not unchanged, but constant. There were still hard days, there always are. There were doctor's visits, and moments of fatigue, quiet nights, when I caught her staring out the window longer than usual. But there was laughter too. Music in the kitchen. The smell of cinnamon, shared books, long walks under falling leaves. There were Sundays where nothing happened and everything felt perfect. Eventually, I did move in fully. The guest room became mine in name only. Most of my clothes lived in her dresser drawers, and we no longer thought in terms of yours and mine. It was ours. This house. This rhythm. This quiet, extraordinary life. We never married. We didn't need to. Our bond didn't need paperwork to make it real. It lived in the spaces between our routines, in the brush of her shoulder against mine as we passed in the hall, in the way she always left the porch light on if I came home late, in the way I always brewed 2 cups of tea, even if she was still asleep. It was in everything. Small, sacred, steady, and then one night, after dinner, after dishes. After a song played low on the radio, we sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars blink into the navy sky. She leaned into me and said, I haven't said it yet. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I wanted the words to find me naturally. I turned, heart slowing, listening. She smiled, eyes soft. "I love you, and I have for a while now." I took her hand in mine, felt the pulse steady and sure beneath her skin, and replied, "I know, I love you too. Since the moment you asked me to stay." And we did. We stayed. Through morning light and winter storms. Through healing and memory and every ordinary moment in between. We stayed, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. Because love, when it finds you late, isn't any less powerful. If anything, it's deeper, fuller, quieter in its brilliance. And if you're lucky, it doesn't just change your story. It gives you a whole new one to live. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.